Morning, everyone, and welcome to Global Health Grand Rounds today. My name is Garen Stone, and I'm the MGH Global Medicine Program Director. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first Global Health Grand Rounds of this year. It's exciting not only as it's the first of this year, but it's also our first combined Grand Round session between the MGH Center for Global Health and the Brigham and Women's Division of Global Health Equity. With these monthly sessions, our hope is to build connections and community both within and across institutions. We want to learn from and alongside one another. Before I introduce today's Grand Round speaker, Professor Simukai Chigudu, we wanted to invite Dr. Louise Ivers, the Executive Director of the MGH Center for Global Health, and Dr. Paul Farmer, the Chief of Brigham and Women's Division of Global Health Equity, to share a few words with you.
Thanks very much, Garen. I will just say that I'm delighted to welcome our speaker, and I'm really thrilled that MGH and Brigham and Women's Hospital are coming together around global health for this talk series, not least because Brigham and Women's and Mass General Hospital have been coming together around global health for a very long time. I've had the pleasure of working at both institutions, and I know how much we share in common about our values and our approach, and we have a lot of complementarity to our work. So I'm really thrilled that this is the first one to get us going. And Dr. Farmer, I welcome you to add a comment if you wish.
Thanks, Louise. As they say in writing notes, agree with above. And Simukai, you're doing us a great honor by kicking off, or rather re-kicking off, since we do this ritually between the two hospitals. As Louise said, we pretty much all of us have long experience working in both institutions. So you're bringing together, Simukai, a couple hundred folks who care a lot about global health equity, and I believe in the way you do, and will be instructed by even your experimental endeavors to get us beyond the current moment. So I'll kick it back to you, and we all thank you in bringing us for bringing us together. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ivers and Dr. Farmer. For those of you joining us, we do have information on CME and CEUs in the slideshow right now, and we'll post those links so you can register for those. And now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Professor Simukai Chigudu is Associate Professor of African Politics at the Oxford Department of International Development and a Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford University. He's the author of The Political Life of an Epidemic, Cholera, Crisis, and Citizenship in Zimbabwe, an examination of the social and political causes and consequences of Zimbabwe's catastrophic cholera outbreak in 2008-2009, the worst in African history. This monograph has won the Theodore J. Lowy First Book Award from the American Political Science Association. More generally, Professor Chigudu is interested in the social politics of inequality in Africa and has conducted research in Zimbabwe, Uganda, the Gambia, and Tanzania. He has publications in several leading social science and medical journals. Prior to working in academia, Professor Chigudu was a medical doctor in the UK's National Health Service. He holds a PhD in international development from the Oxford University, for which he was awarded the biennial Audrey Richards Prize for the best doctoral thesis in African studies examined at a UK university. As a graduate student, Professor Chigudu was a founding member of Rhodes Must Fall in Oxford and has become an engaged participant in public debates on the cultural politics of colonialism and racism, often writing for the Guardian newspaper. Professor Chigudu is currently writing his first book for the trade, When Will We Be Free? Living in the Shadow of Empire and the Struggle for Decolonization. This book will combine memoir, political history, and cultural criticism to show how colonialism continues to shape politics, society, and culture in Africa and in Britain, and to explore what it really means to decolonize. It's truly a privilege and honor to have you with us today, Professor Chigudu. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I really think the honor is all mine. When I was a medical student, I was studying in the northeast of England, which for those of you who've been there is a very, very particular part of the world. And it can feel a little bit disconnected, shall we say, from the wider projects of global health. And it was some of the work that's come out of your institution, some of the work that Paul Farmer has written and engaged with, that began to open up the world to me and help me see the bridges between my background growing up in Africa and studying medicine in the UK, and starting to combine that into the frame of global health. Since then, as a physician turned social scientist, I've kind of focused my attention thinking both with and against global health as an endeavor that's worthy of pursuit, but often demanding of critical self-reflection about what it is we think we're doing under the guise or under the umbrella title of global health. And as I was saying just before the call, I started writing a paper during the first lockdown of last year, as I was trying to make sense not only of our current moment, but trying to understand where Africa was kind of framed in a lot of the commentary around the COVID-19 pandemic. So the paper I'm presenting today is a kind of work in progress, thinking through that particular set of questions. I've opted not to use any slides, so I'm going to kind of talk and to read. But I'm looking forward to just a really engaging discussion. Okay. So Emile died 8 years ago, almost to the day. The Ghanaian toddler had fallen severely ill with high fever, vomiting, and bloody stools, allegedly after playing with a dead bat. It wasn't long until his mother and 3-year-old sister developed similar symptoms, but with considerably more blood. They both died shortly afterward. Emile's grandmother then sought help from a nurse in a nearby town. Lacking training and medical supplies, the nurse could give little help for her symptoms. The grandmother returned home, where she died the next day. Feeling ill himself, the nurse jumped on a bus to a larger town to seek treatment from a doctor. A day later, he was dead. The doctor he had visited succumbed soon thereafter. Posterity now knows Emile as Patient Zero, the first infected case of an Ebola epidemic that would ultimately claim nearly 12,000 lives over the course of 2 years. Ebola hemorrhagic fever, as you will all know, is one of the most virulent diseases known to humanity. It is also terrifying. One moment, victims are complaining of fever, headache, and a sore throat, and then the next, they are doubled up with abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea. As the symptoms worsen, many also develop a dazed, glassy expression and a purple rash accompanied by hiccups, likely caused by irritation to the nerves that control the diaphragm. But the most alarming symptoms occur several days into illness, when cells infected by the Ebola virus attach themselves to the inside of blood vessels. This causes bloody fluids to leak from the mouth, the nose, the anus, the vagina, and even on occasion from the eyes. Ebola is especially damaging to the liver, where the virus wipes out cells required to produce coagulation proteins and other important components of plasma. Eventually, this damage reaches a point of no return. Patients suffer a fatal drop in blood pressure, and that terminates in shock and multi-organ failure. Ebola's case fatality rate is extremely high. The majority of people, if not properly and urgently treated, will die within days of developing symptoms. But the disease does not spread easily. Why then? Just a few weeks after Emile died, had the infectious illness crossed Guinea's borders into Freetown and Monrovia. Now, the answer to this question is complicated. Epidemics typically occur through the convergence of multiple different factors. And yet, initial public health and media attention, especially in the Western world, quickly pointed to exotic explanations for the emergence and spread of this epidemic. The outbreak was readily blamed on a lethal combination of so-called African customs, such as the eating of bushmeat, an aversion to modern medicine, and traditional burial practices that include washing, touching, and kissing the deceased. This was a tragic case of science confronts culture, as Amy Maxman reported in the National Geographic. But less discussed were the structural and political factors at play in the region, such as poverty or a deep distrust of the government, or indeed weak health systems. After all, 90% of those privileged enough to be transported to hospitals in Europe or the United States survived the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Organizations from around the world responded to the West African Ebola virus epidemic. In July 2014, the World Health Organization convened an emergency meeting with health ministers from 11 countries and announced collaboration on a strategy to coordinate technical support to combat the outbreak. By August of the same year, the WHO had declared Ebola to be an international public health emergency, and the organization published a roadmap to guide and coordinated global responses to the outbreak, aiming to stop Ebola transmission worldwide within a period of 6 to 9 months. In September, the UN Security Council declared the Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa to be a threat to international peace and security, and unanimously adopted a resolution urging UN member states to provide more resources to fight the outbreak. The WHO stated that the cost for combating the epidemic would be at minimum about $1 billion. Now, these responses to the epidemic were shaped by what the sociologist Andrew Lakoff describes as two regimes of global health. On one hand, the Ebola epidemic was treated as a potential threat to international peace and security, as per the UN Security Council's declaration. It followed then that only the militaries of developed nations would have the logistical capacity and technical expertise to speedily enforce quarantine measures and carry out surveillance for further cases. As one British Army officer put it, the international community had to be seen to be doing something quickly, and one of the best ways to do that is to deploy the military. Deploy the military and we will work out exactly what they're going to do afterward, he said. Yet the effectiveness of a military response beyond the optics of protecting wealthy countries from a new threat emanating from Africa was questionable. And on the other hand, donors to the region had been investing millions into targeting specific diseases like HIV/AIDS, malaria, and tuberculosis for years. National governments, often seen as corrupt or incompetent, were bypassed, and finding a technical magic bullet solution to implement was key, even if that meant that on the ground, health systems deteriorated. For Lakoff, these two regimes of global health are labeled global health security and humanitarian biomedicine. Global health security focuses on emerging infectious diseases, which are seen to threaten wealthy countries and which typically, though not always, emanate from Africa, Latin America, or Asia. This regime of global health is oriented towards outbreaks of such pathogens as weaponized smallpox, SARS, highly virulent influenza, and hemorrhagic fevers. What's crucial is that this regime is built on anticipation. It is conceptually and institutionally directed at outbreaks that have not yet occurred and indeed may never occur. For this reason, global health security is operationalized through systems of preparedness, such as real-time global disease surveillance and early warning letters for events whose likelihood is incalculable, but whose political, economic, and health consequences could be catastrophic. To achieve this goal, global health security initiatives weave together an intricate web of organizations ranging from multilateral health agencies to national disease control institutions, from collaborative reference laboratories to vaccine distribution systems. Critics of global health security, like Philippe Collin of Médecins Sans Frontières, argue there is no escaping the conclusion that the harvest of outbreak intelligence is essentially geared to benefit wealthy nations. Humanitarian biomedicine is more expansive than global health security, concerning itself with a wider and less immediate array of health issues that might include access to essential medicines, prevention programs, or drug development for neglected diseases. In Lakoff's reading, these two regimes are not contradictory, but complementary. Humanitarian biomedicine functions as a kind of philanthropic palliative to nation states that lack public health infrastructure in exchange for the right to international health organizations to monitor these populations for outbreaks that might threaten wealthy nations. Now, of course, these regimes are somewhat stylistic, but they're helpful optics. They show how global health can implicitly view the nation state in the developing world as threatening to either the international within the health security paradigm or to the suffering individual in the humanitarianism paradigm. Both regimes accord preeminence to transnational institutions and actors to remedy these biological and political pathologies in developing countries. We might then think of these regimes of global health as a convergence of biopolitics and geopolitics. Now, the logics of global health regimes, I want to suggest, and their justification are often smuggled into popular consciousness through the vehicle of outbreak narratives. So even a casual perusal of media depictions and scientific writing about the Ebola outbreak reveals a number of recurring themes. Cause, consequence, and intervention are represented at different scales, allowing for both subtle and overt shifts in the presentation of arguments about what must be done to respond to an emerging disease epidemic. A toddler playing with a dead bat in rural Guinea is an entry point to frame a wider set of claims about global health security and intervention. And indeed, in this presentation, I frame my own discussion to mirror this style of reportage. We can examine the scale of politics, this shift from the hyperlocal, from the anecdotal to a wider, more universal or global set of concerns through narratives, or as the historian of medicine Charles Rosenberg puts it, the dramaturgy of the outbreak. Like the acts in a conventionally structured play, Rosenberg writes, the events of a classic epidemic succeed each other in predictable narrative sequence. They start at a moment in time, proceed on a stage limited in space and duration, following a plot line of increasing and revelatory tension. They move to a crisis of collective and individual character before ultimately drifting toward closure. In another of its dramaturgic aspects, Rosenberg continues, an epidemic takes on the quality of a pageant. It mobilizes communities to act out propitiatory rituals that incorporate and reaffirm social values and modes of understanding. So we see this in the routine and repeated postures of the humanitarian, the scientist, and the politician during an epidemic emergency. The literary critic Priscilla Wald examines this dramaturgy to provide a more in-depth theory of the outbreak narrative. Her 2008 book, Contagious, is a kind of latitudinarian survey of scientific publication, investigative journalism, narrative fiction, and popular film, in which the outbreak narrative unfolds again and again and again, according to a familiar dramaturgy. For Wald, the outbreak narrative is not a benign literary trope. It has consequences. As it disseminates information, the outbreak narrative affects survival rates and contagion routes. It promotes or diminishes the stigmatization of individuals, of groups, of behaviors, and of entire geographic regions. And it also changes and restructures economies. Crucially, Wald argues, the outbreak narrative influences how both scientists and the lay public understand the nature and consequences of infection and how they imagine appropriate responses. So we see the outbreak narrative playing out in the course of the COVID-19 pandemic. The drama of our present predicament began at a specific moment on a limited stage, the wet markets of Wuhan in late 2019. Soon, the disease spread with astonishing speed through the circuits of global modernity, trade, finance, tourism, all the while stoking anxiety about China's capacity to tip our species into collective ecological and pathological destruction. Chasing after the coronavirus came a familiar and contradictory array of reactions about the obsolescence and tenacity of borders, the threat and benevolence of strangers, the failures and redemptive potential of medical science. These reactions, I think, can be interpreted as part of the increasing and revelatory tension that Rosenberg initially describes and that Wald elaborates on. So our collective crisis in response to COVID-19 has been self-evident. It has forced multiple reckonings with the weaknesses built into our social and political systems, with the scourge of economic insecurity, with the shortcomings of global institutions that are ostensibly designed to forge universal consensus. And yet, this reckoning must not be lost as we glean inchoate signs of a drift toward closure. The success of vaccination programs, particularly in the global north, animates another key feature of the outbreak narrative, the ultimate and inevitable triumph of science and its corollary human will. Okay, so where is Africa in all of this? The outbreak narrative, in its more classic iteration, typically treats Africa as either the primordial origin of disease or its final destination. In both cases, Africa functions as a kind of symbolic foil to Euro-America, a kind of perennial site of alterity. So in the first act of the COVID-19 drama, in which a beleaguered Euro-America struggled to come to terms with the human and economic costs of the pandemic, Africa was nevertheless discursively placed as the virus's final frontier, where we were repeatedly assured COVID-19 would yield untold damage. Numerous headlines by journalists, policymakers, and scientists alike warned us that the virus is a ticking time bomb on a continent woefully ill-equipped to deal with COVID-19. Legitimate concerns about weak health systems, densely populated urban areas, and a history of devastating epidemics mingled with racist ideas about the ineluctable nature of African poverty and of a people incapable of responding with ingenuity to a crisis. Contrasting the horror of COVID-19 in the global north with its presumed trajectory in Africa provokes an important yet submerged political question. How and why is it that the suffering induced by communicable diseases is treated as unthinkable in one place and inevitable in another? Now, to my mind, there are two obvious answers to this question. The first is Africa's long association with pathology. The Harvard anthropologist Jean Komaroff recounts how medicine held a special place in the imagination that colonized Africa in the 19th century. Komaroff traces the rising hegemony of biology in European science to a wider political project of domination and control. As an object of European speculation, Africans personified suffering and degeneracy, their environmental hothouse and of fever and affliction. The dialectical relationship then between colonialism and biomedicine affixed to Africa the status of the pathological, a continent that is a natural incubator of disease, always in need of healing. These ideas have proven sticky. They emerge time and again with greater or less sophistication in the ideational architectures of development, international health, medical humanitarianism, and now global health. The second answer, I think, is a fear that epidemic diseases poses an existential threat to political systems in Africa. This motif appears recurrently in pessimistic accounts of the impact that HIV/AIDS, or cholera or Ebola might have on national security, economic development, and good governance. So back in 2003, for instance, the writer, scholar, policy analyst, Alex DeVol sounded the alarm about HIV/AIDS, arguing that the pandemic would reverse what he called the normal processes of Africa's demographic transition, economic development, and state functioning. In theory, DeVol wrote, an African country could succumb to a combination of these regressive processes in a toxic synergy that could lead through nonlinear regression to complete social collapse. This scenario of an AIDS-related national crisis, in DeVol's argument, cannot be ruled out and is sufficiently disturbing to need to be taken seriously. Crucially, early speculation about the impact of COVID-19 on Africa followed similar lines of argument. An infectious disease is going to lead to state failure continent-wide. What's interesting is that DeVol himself revised his thinking about the capacity of epidemics to bring about a dystopian future. During the West African Ebola outbreak, for instance, DeVol argued for more attention to be paid to civilian public health programming, to the preservation of human rights, and to the utilization of local epidemiology in epidemic response. And so DeVol's reversal is a kind of inversion of the earlier scalar shift that I described, in which the goodwill and resources of global health must follow the local lead of grounded knowledge. So at stake here are both the effects of the outbreak as well as the presumed universalism and normative interventions baked into global health ideology. So these two answers that I've presented demonstrate, I think, the ultimate shortcoming of the outbreak narrative, including and especially with respect to Africa. In Priscilla Wald's literary history of the outbreak narrative, she concludes with a trenchant critique. She argues that outbreak narratives naturalize difference and they belie politics by presenting disease as an ever-present threat to be conquered by medical science. This style of thinking has been very much at play in the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, where headlines about a race for a vaccine quickly became ubiquitous and cliche. betraying a collective common sense about the ultimate resolution of epidemics. Disease emergence, Walt continues, is an urgent problem in the global north, not only or even primarily because disease may spread from south to north, but because of the role that the north plays in perpetuating the very conditions of poverty and underdevelopment worldwide. Walt suggests that it is possible to revise the outbreak narrative to tell the story of disease emergence, human connection, and outbreak response in the language of social justice, rather than through the narrower frames of susceptibility, risk, and biomedical science. So Walt's suggestion that we can tell the story of disease emergence and human connection is compelling. It's one I fully agree with, but to do so is not entirely straightforward. It seems to me that we have to take the idea of disease emergence seriously as a kind of intellectual construct and one that has a history. We have to ask ourselves, how did the idea of disease emergence arise? How was it formulated? And what explains how the concept of disease emergence has come to condition so much of our thinking about the origins and nature of pandemics? Scientific concepts are not simply neutral mirrors of nature. They are often contingent forms of understanding and representing the human experience. They depend in large part upon the cultural logic of the society from which they emanate. So to take a bit of a historical view here, ever since the development of germ theory in the late 19th century, modern biology imagined human beings and microbes to be engaged in a kind of merciless war of attrition that would ultimately yield only one survivor. The arc of this war began to change after the Second World War, as public health institutions gradually declared victory over microbes. Through the 1950s to the 70s, a new epoch in human microbial relations appeared on the horizon in microbiological discourse. Infectious disease could be conquered for the good, sequestered, quarantined, and even eliminated. Certainly when I was in medical school, I was strongly advised against going into infectious disease as a specialism because it was a kind of dying specialty. As late as 1978, the United Nations issued an accord predicting that even the poorest nations would undergo an epidemiological transition. Now, it's no coincidence that this narrative appeared and achieved preeminence in the heyday of modernization theories of development. Both paradigms emphasized the need of a training of a professional class in Western disciplines, epidemiology and laboratory science in the world of medicine, and economics in the world of development. And these disciplines were needed to produce knowledge about the developing world and serve as the basis for any kind of humanitarian intervention, broadly conceived. Epidemiological transition and modernization theories of development shared a common teleological logic in which the rates of infectious disease, malnutrition, and childbirth would all decrease through improvements in the conditions of daily life and through the advent of a new generation of drugs and vaccines. Life expectancy would increase and chronic illnesses would eventually become the significant problem in public health. Most public health in Africa during the course of the past century has developed within this narrative of epidemiological progress. The microbiologist René Dubos was an early dissenter in this conception of human microbial relations. Back in the 50s, the French-American scientist coined the term emergence as a way of redescribing the temporality of biological evolution. Dubos prefigured what would later be known as the new microbiology. By emergence, Dubos argued that microbes do not only evolve through the gradual accumulation of local mutations, but are capable of sudden transitions that are inherently unpredictable in linear terms from a single mutation. The salience of this argument was radical. Dubos was suggesting that the assumption that antimicrobial drugs could always remain ahead of pathogens in the evolutionary game was both misguided and even dangerous. The new microbiology, ushered in by genetic recombination technologies, would vindicate some of Dubos' key ideas. By the 1980s, the scientific community had learned that bacteria evolved through highly accelerated processes of horizontal communication rather than only through chance mutation and selective pressures. And by 2003, when the Human Genome Project was completed, scientists demonstrated the vast extent to which the human genetic map was littered with fragments of viruses. This is because certain types of viruses, including HIV as we know, bear the distinct ability to copy and paste their own genetic material into the DNA of their host cells, and have in fact been doing so throughout human evolution. All told, researchers estimate that human beings are about 8% virus. So the conceptual revolution afoot in microbiology was a shift away from anthropocentric understandings of human microbial relations, in which microbes are understood to be separate, foreign, contaminating entities, towards an understanding of human microbial relations as one of inescapable co-evolution. So, in the words of the theorist Melinda Cooper, microbes are inside us, in our history, but also implicated in the continuing evolution of all the forms of life on Earth. But Dubos's insights were actually twofold. Not only did he prefigure the new microbiology, but he was also an early advocate of a heightened sense of alert to microbial threats. Thus, Dubos did not argue against war with microbes altogether, but rather he imagined a different theater of war, one in which we accept that even our most violent efforts to secure ourselves against pathogens will be met with resistance. Microbes, like the empire, will inevitably strike back at some unpredictable time and in some unforeseeable manner. And so, by May 1st, 1989, the American scientific world had fully embraced advances in the new microbiology and its implications for human microbial relations. The National Institutes of Health and Rockefeller University co-sponsored a conference on emerging viruses, a term coined by its chair, the virologist and immunologist Stephen Morse. The conference brought together more than 200 prominent scientists and public health experts. Morse and his colleague, the Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist Joshua Lederberg, convened the meeting in order to discuss their concerns about the appearance of new infectious organisms such as HIV, Ebola, hantaviruses, and the recrudescence of known pathogens in more virulent and drug-resistant strains. In his keynote address at the conference in May, Joshua Lederberg warned that, in his words, the single biggest threat to man's continued dominance on the planet is the virus. Morse elaborated, arguing that viral emergence would be catalyzed by urbanization, environmental degradation, war, and migration on a global scale. Such processes, concentrated in the global south, especially in Africa, would accelerate interspecies viral traffic. As Morse put it, like every other kind of traffic, viral traffic is increasing. As deforestation progresses worldwide, as human activities continue to alter the environment, as population influx into third world cities continues unabated, as every part of the world becomes more accessible, one would expect disease emergence to accelerate. So in a sense, we're seeing the kind of modern era of an old colonial trope about the kind of capacity of the global south and of Africa in particular to incubate disease. It's difficult to overstate the reach and influence of Morse and Lederberg's stark warnings about disease in a world that they saw as out of balance, where processes of global change and interconnection pose profound threats to the future of the species. The National Academy of Sciences Institute of Medicine invited Morse and Lederberg to co-chair a scientific committee on the effects of global change on American health and security in the 1990s. Their report was titled Emerging Infections, Microbial Threats to Health in the United States. And it transformed Morse's ideas into a civic advocacy campaign. And yet, as the historian of science Nicholas King warns, the category of emerging disease is not an unproblematic reflection of changes in the global burden of disease. In the biological world, there are specific diseases. There are no emerging diseases per se. Rather, the term is a kind of convenient heuristic, a shorthand device to talk about a set of complicated epidemiological events. Nevertheless, with the civic advocacy campaign, the category of emerging infectious disease was reified, reproduced, and disseminated through elaborate networks of circulation and consumption. Emerging diseases kind of transmogrified from a descriptive shorthand of disparate biological processes into a coherent and singular scientific agenda. Over the 1990s, this category of emerging diseases became the centerpiece of scientific reports and conferences. It was used as an institutional framework for understanding risk and responses, and it spawned a new academic subdiscipline. In 1995 alone, meetings of the Institute of Medicine and the New York Academy of Medicine were devoted to the topic. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention launched the online journal Emerging Infectious Diseases, and the World Health Organization established a division of emerging and other communicable diseases, surveillance and control. So in a sense, this period solidified what's become a banal truism, which has come to furnish the outbreak narrative, that infectious diseases do not recognize borders. And it's a truism that crossed over from debates within the scientific community into popular consciousness through a broad cultural matrix aided by the gripping, if not alarmist, journalism about the dangers of globalization. So in February 1994, the journalist Robert Kaplan presented a deeply dystopian vision of a planet racked by barbaric ethnic conflicts, global disparities in wealth and security, and escalating wars over natural resources. His Atlantic Monthly article titled "The Coming Anarchy" warned that the horrific poverty and political fragmentation of West Africa posed a profound threat to the wider world, especially to the United States. Later that year, the science journalist Laurie Garrett published a colossal book called "The Coming Plague: Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance." And it was based partly upon her reportage of epidemics in Africa. She too presented a dystopian scenario of a world in which poverty and political fragmentation could lead to global catastrophe. Africa yet again became a symbolic resource for the projection of American anxieties about a changing world. And actually, this was translated into popular film. There was I forget which year, I think it was 95, the Dustin Hoffman film Outbreak, about fictional outbreak from Africa, was kind of the most extreme kind of dramatic rendering of these ideas. So these ideas, or these anxieties, I should say, reached their apotheosis in what Melinda Cooper describes as the biological turn in the War on Terror. Cooper points out that in the aftermath of the 2001 anthrax attacks, the Bush administration became the first in American history to implement a national defense strategy against biological threats. It authorized $5.6 billion for the purchase and stockpiling of vaccines and drugs against bioterrorist threats. It established 4 research centers for the testing of biological weapons defenses and granted new governmental dispensation for the overriding of drug regulations during a national emergency. Official documents declared that infectious disease outbreaks and bioterrorism should be treated as identical threats in the absence of any sure means of distinguishing between the two. All of this was, of course, a major boon to the biotech and pharmaceutical industries. Now, as Nicholas King has argued, the category of emerging disease can be understood as a commodity. And like other commodities, it is being produced by specific actors, distributed according to specific and pre-existing networks of circulation and consumed by specific audiences. But in the process, it is constantly reconfigured. And so I think this helps us understand some of the differences between innovations in genetic science and an attempt to understand human microbial relations at a kind of molecular and scientific level, to the sorts of anxieties about bioterrorism and the kind of capitalist production that we saw accompanying the war on terror. So the emerging disease worldview might have had its origins in the new microbiology, but it is now inseparable from American cultural hegemony, the military-industrial complex, and global capitalism, forces that have powerfully shaped the worlds of global health and development. The emerging diseases worldview has helped turn global health into a multi-billion-dollar enterprise founded by large multinational organizations, bilateral organizations, public-private partnerships, private philanthropies, and most notably the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, if it's still called that. So far, few, if any, institutions are in place to monitor this expansive and somewhat disordered field. So, in practice, the interests and concerns of donors and not recipients tend to predominate global health, and the operations of international organizations tend to reinforce existing and unequal power relations between countries. Okay, so let's return to COVID-19. The trajectory of COVID-19 in Africa confounded the outbreak narrative and its warnings of catastrophe in Africa. On May 22nd, 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic reached a milestone with more than 100,000 confirmed cases in Africa. It took 14 weeks for the virus to spread to every country on the continent. The WHO observed that despite crossing the threshold of 100,000 cases, the pandemic, which had struck with such devastating force in much of the world, appeared to be taking a different pathway in Africa. Case numbers had not grown at the same exponential rate as in other regions, and so far Africa has not experienced the same high mortality seen in Europe and the United States. So on September 29th last year, the world passed the mark of 1 million reported deaths, although of course we know that the true figure is higher. On the same day, the count for Africa was a cumulative 35,954. Africa accounts for 17% of the global population, but only 3.5% of reported global COVID-19 deaths. And as of this week, or at least as of yesterday when I checked, the cumulative caseload in Africa stood at about 6 million cases, confirmed cases, with about 150,000 confirmed deaths. By contrast, the UK alone, where I live, has recorded 9 million cases and 140,000 deaths. And as you'll be more familiar than me, the US has had a cumulative total of about 46 million cases and about 746,000 deaths. However, when I speak to African audiences in particular, I remind us that we can't be complacent or smug in our analysis. Cases continue to rise in Africa. It took 52 days to reach the first 10,000 cases, but it only took 11 days to move from 30,000 to 50,000. Moreover, the pandemic does remain a major threat to the continent's health systems, both directly and indirectly. A new WHO modeling study predicts that if containment measures were to fail, even with a lower number of cases requiring hospitalization than elsewhere in the world, the medical capacity in many African countries could be overwhelmed. So how has Africa defied expectations? It's difficult to say for certain, though a number of population factors have been identified as protective, including the country's relatively young demographic profile. There is the influence of climatic differences between countries in the global north and in Africa. There's the possibility of widespread pre-existing immunity, possibly through higher rates of BCG vaccination. There are genetic factors. I believe some studies have suggested that the haplotype associated with increased risk of COVID-19 infection is present in 30% of South Asian genomes and 8% of Europeans, but is almost entirely absent in Africa. And of course, there are a range of behavioral factors influencing the picture. Geography matters too, with respect to uneven population density, much greater in urban than in rural areas, and the only partial integration of many countries in the networks of the global economy. And importantly, public health responses in many countries have been quite strong, even compared to many parts of the West. So at the start of the epidemic, the kind of dominant model for government responses was predicated on flattening the curve. This strategy sought to implement social distancing measures to such an extent that ongoing rates of infection would be reduced enough not to overwhelm hospital admissions. The result would be a longer period of infection in the general population, but with a lower peak at any one time. This was certainly the strategy that the UK rather disastrously tried to implement. And so the model hinged on the capacity of national economies to absorb the shock of lockdown on the supply side of the economy and on the capacity of healthcare providers to treat extant illness, It also relied on public health professionals to implement community management and of scientists to innovate us out of the pandemic through vaccines, new testing measures, and antiviral drugs. But the model has not been followed faithfully anywhere in the world. And there are some obvious flaws in the kind of dominant model of flattening the curve as a kind of universal template. So it's cliche, but true, that one size does not fit all. Exporting flattening the curve model wholesale to a continent as disparate and complex as Africa is foolhardy. We already know that continent-wide, there have been a great variety of actual and possible COVID-19 responses and strategies to address concerns about home care, resource allocations, food insecurity, livelihoods, and the like. Responses have been delivered by a large range of actors involved in different interventions. Across a range of contexts, there are kind of complex tensions and trade-offs between livelihoods and public health, between state-led and community-led responses, and between kind of gold standard practices of evidence-based medicine against the necessity of what Julie Livingston calls improvised medicine. But there is another deeper conceptual issue to be concerned about. The outbreak narrative glosses over all of this diversity, complexity, and uncertainty that are, I want to suggest, an inherent part of pandemics. The idea of a continent perennially on the brink of disaster creates a powerful anticipatory regime of pandemic catastrophe for Africa. As Vincam Adams and her co-authors have written, anticipation is not just betting on the future, it is a moral economy in which the future sets the conditions of possible action in the present. So anticipating pandemic catastrophe encourages a narrow view of what the true public health picture is, and it encourages a kind of disease exceptionalism. The idea that an entire health system should be oriented around a single pathogen. And this has been a kind of recurrent motif in how so much global health intervention has been organized in African history. Disease exceptionalism can and has resulted in a maldistribution of health resources. It creates new or contingent forms of biological citizenship that allow some people to live on the basis of their diagnosis while condemning others to death. We saw this in how HIV exceptionalism, as scholars like Adia Benton have written so powerfully about, created massive distortions in public health provisioning within Africa, including the neglect of health systems level interventions, as well as non-communicable disease. And certainly during the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that a major cause of excess mortality in sub-Saharan Africa has been due to disruptions in medical care and prevention programs related to malaria, TB, HIV, and other illnesses, as attention has shifted toward COVID-19. And so finally, disease exceptionalism does not allow for, I would argue, a truer or fuller vision of global health equity. The slow, demanding work of institution building on the one hand, but also the flexible adaptation and application of contextual knowledge to a crisis. So kind of as I move towards my concluding remarks here, I want to kind of reaffirm one of my key arguments, that the category of emerging disease is a social construct. And it's one that has issued the outbreak narrative with a kind of consistent and self-contained ontology of epidemic disease. In turn, the outbreak narrative has been adopted by a wide variety of actors who yield it with tremendous flexibility to suit their own purposes. And so by now it should be clear that the outbreak narrative is not some neutral reflection of biological reality. It's a kind of vehicle that takes us to genetic interactions between humans and microbes that scientists are constantly working on, through a set of cultural processes and into a wider realm of shifting geopolitical interests. The outbreak narrative comes equipped with a moral economy and a historical account. It explains how and why we find ourselves in the situations that we do now. It identifies heroes and villains, and it ascribes blame for failures and credit for triumphs. The outbreak narrative works because it presents itself as a kind of universalizing template for understanding interactions between humans and microbes worldwide. And the rules and assumptions that it lays out are presumed to be globally applicable, despite all of the evidence that this way of thinking about and narrating the world doesn't quite fit empirical reality. So in my own monograph, The Political Life of an Epidemic, I argue for a new social theory of epidemics. I suggest that we think of epidemics as having multiple ontologies, as opposed to the single, elegant, coherent ontology presupposed in the emerging diseases worldview and the outbreak narrative. My conviction in this argument has only grown since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Epidemics, as I see it, resist parsimonious explanation because they are always many things at the same time. They are certainly biological phenomena, an infectious disease occurring in a given population in excess of normal expectancy. But they're also social phenomena as they spread through populations in socially patterned ways. They are historical phenomena, right? They don't emerge ex nihilo, but they come through the culmination of multi-scalar and political economic processes that obtain over time. They are cultural phenomena, as I've discussed through the outbreak narrative, and they are political phenomena. Anytime an epidemic is declared, it is not only a scientific observation, but it is a set of political choices about the attention, resources, and priority that should be given to what is effectively a social emergency. And ultimately, we live in a biosphere. Human microbial relations are intimately entwined. Communicable diseases will always be a part of life, and they will emerge and circulate. Human beings will suffer and die. And at the same time, there is nothing natural about epidemics emerging from Africa, nor anything inevitable about epidemics causing devastation on the continent. The challenge here is to transform the political, social, and institutional logics of epidemic response. And failing to do so will make the outbreak narrative a self-fulfilling prophecy, even though this outbreak narrative is not a self-evident truth. Okay, I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Chigudu. I'm Joe Radigan. I am the Associate Director of the Division of Global Health Equity at the Brigham and Women's. I'm going to be moderating our discussion, so please, if you have a chance, you have a question to ask, just put it in the chat. And Dr. Chigudu, could I start with a question?
Please, yeah.
The wonderful talk, incredibly enlightening. I was wondering if we could get your thoughts a little bit about you talk about epidemics as this convergence of biopolitics and geopolitics. And then you brought up later in your talk about global capitalism. And I was just curious if you had any thoughts about, where we are now in terms of, because as you know, right, the epidemic, as you mentioned, was in terms of its effects on our economic system was seen as a supply and demand shock. And now it seems that we've kind of pivoted to like the commodification of cure in some ways around the vaccine. How do you see that trajectory as impacting Africa?
Oh, that's a great question. And so I guess there's this kind of multi-layered, interaction between the natures and structures of capitalism and the epidemic. So we have sort of suggested the idea that or the argument I'm making that that an idea like emerging disease as a kind of paradigm can itself become a commodity, right? And then it enters circulation all of these ways. And then you have capitalism working through the kind of philanthro-capitalist mode of how a lot of global health works. And I think that what we've seen in the pandemic, I think, has been a sort of failure of the institutions that are supposed to regulate global public goods on the basis of a kind of a social ethos, right? I think that, and there are a host of factors here. I think to point the finger at the United States for a moment, if I may, I don't think it helped, right, that this pandemic occurred with a nationalist president who was kind of clear about his antipathy toward institutions of global cooperation like the WHO. And that has its problems and its flaws, but I think as a sort of model of organizing global health, I think WHO and other multilateral institutions based on kind of goodwill, cooperation, buy-in, at least at an ideational or at level, like I think that model sort of failed. And so I think that what we've seen is a lot of like innovative work that's happened, whether it's for-profit or whether it's purely in the academic sector. So I'm thinking of my own university and the speed with which my colleagues were involved in kind of discovering and developing the AstraZeneca virus, right? That wasn't done by market incentives. And yet, as vaccines have kind of entered the global picture, we're back to a model of a kind of hybrid philanthro-capitalist way of distributing the vaccine worldwide. And it seems to me that Africa is kind of coming out as the loser in this story, that a collective social public ethos, a kind of, at a sort of, if you like, almost anthropogenic scale, something that's commensurate with the crisis that we face has not played out that way. And I think that we've seen the sort of intersection of both capitalism and a kind of vaccine nationalism or infectious disease nationalism conjoining together. But I also don't think that's the end of the story, right? I think be interesting to see what comes of COP26 and whether discussions around climate change and the Anthropocene force a greater conversation about multilateralism, global cooperation, and whether the US can reconfigure its role. So I think that we're still caught in a sort of ongoing story that I'm trying to make sense of. But the last thing I'd say is, and I imagine there'll be many people in this audience who are even more informed than me, but certainly speaking to colleagues in Zimbabwe, my home country, there is a kind of deep pessimism about the Western world and their ability to halt the outbreak in Africa. And instead there has been a turning towards China, totally different economic model, and to Russia for access and distribution of vaccines. And so we're seeing new workings of kind of soft power and health diplomacy here, coming from a model of Chinese late state capitalism, quite different to the older structures of global health that we're more familiar with.
Thanks, thank you. That's really enlightening. That's really helpful. Dr. Farmer, you have your hand up?
Well, I just want to begin by saying that, we're all kind of gobsmacked, as you say over there, by the complexity of your analysis, your willingness to wrestle all these things to the ground, history, political economy, recent developments around vaccines, remote ones regarding previous vaccines, previous outbreaks on that continent and another. It's just a very admirable exercise. And, I just hearing Joe's question and your answer to it kind of moved me away from the question I was going to ask and towards a more tentative one. In resuscitating this old paradigm, the balance paradigm, and showing that it's secular, modern, but also the era of an old and global trope, and linking that to outbreak narratives, I think regardless of where this analysis goes, it's already very helpful on that score. And, your ability to group things into somewhat separate and often opposed categories, whether that's fear versus solidarity, or anarchy versus order, or the current chorus that we have now inside global health, which is a sort of surveillance and control group versus the redress and reparations group. And the relative dimensions of these two groups is unclear, although you'd think it would be. And so my question really is about how formed are these groups, because there is a very shocking disconnect, at least one that's most shocking to me, and that's the shocking disconnect about the materiality of the social. Inside the surveillance and control framework, the health security framework, you get a kind of, proudly secular, affect-free approach to this. Hey, we're just trying to be sensible here, people, right? Don't get off on your high horse about the history of colonial rule or the need for reparative action. We're in the middle of dealing with a real emergency right now. And that I'm just wondering, since that goes on, this materialist, and you brought up China, and I'm going to bring it up too now, this materialist, resolutely focused on the material challenges, whether that's housing, healthcare, jobs, a real, social service that's absent in post-colonial Africa and has been. And I'm just going to go back, and I'm sorry to cloud this, but I noticed in reading some British historians of the Spanish flu that this same diversion from the material occurred then as well. More in Britain, according to Sandra Tompkins, for example, the historian wrote about this, than in Australia, the United States, and other parts of that so-called English-speaking world. There was actually more of a focus on relief of distress through soup kitchens, home housing, etc. So back to the big, your big question, which is really, we have these alternative packages of global health, the health surveillance, I'm just using shorthand now, and the solidarity group. And I just wonder if the failure to date of the solidarity faction, the reparative faction, focusing on material reparations and paying attention to the material complaints that we're hearing, why can't we get this across? Is this also a reflection of the fact that decolonizing global health is a debate taking place in affluent universities, whether in Africa or Europe, and not in the homes and neighborhoods of people beleaguered by this material privation that has gone on for so long? So again, how do these two big paradigms fit into the current struggle around decolonized global health? And why won't we listen to people when they say, well, we'd like there to be medical care? That would be quite the innovation.
Thank you so much for those comments and insights. I think that's kind of brilliantly captures so much of what I'm trying to do with this paper. I want to answer your question first with a reflection actually in something that's been happening in the UK. And I say this because, just before the pandemic, so December 2019, the UK opposition party, the Labour Party, led by Jeremy Corbyn, who was kind of an old school British left Marxist, socialist, and yet had managed in a sense to bypass his generation of voters and thinkers and really animate a kind of millennial commitment to socialist ideas, to form a kind of voting coalitional bloc. And they were trounced, totally decimated in the UK's general elections, with the Conservative Party kind of winning out. And then only a few months after that, we had COVID-19. Now, I think one of the things that's striking, and I'm going to scale this up to the global question, but I think one of the things that's sort of striking, reflecting on that moment, okay, I think there were many shortcomings on Jeremy Corbyn's part. He was kind of our version of Bernie Sanders, but less charismatic. But I think there was a kind of battle of ideas happening in the country, as well as competing conceptions of what economic insecurity looks like. And the version or the view that won out was one that tended towards a more libertarian, a more individualistic way of thinking about sort of society. And that idea was kind of in my head when the pandemic occurred, right? It was sort of no coincidence that political parties in the most powerful nations aligned on the right, who feel they had won a political and ideological battle, were also at the helm at the time the epidemic occurs. And I think this, the counterfactual, which can never be, is I wonder whether what that would have looked like had these really left-wing parties in the UK or in the United States, or else we're being in power at that very moment, and how would that have informed things like working through global institutions. So it's kind of, in a sense, the story of global health and the chorus of people involved in these debates is also kind of inseparable, or at least is influenced, I should say, by what's happening at a kind of national political level and how arguments and debates are being presented. And so in general, public consciousness in Britain, as the epidemic began to unfold, the key trope was very much not about global health. It was very much about British exceptionalism. The idea that on this small island, we know what we're doing. We're following the science, which really just became, which was infused with this kind of nationalist undertone that we kind of know what we're doing and we can sort of manage it. And all talk of global solidarity was very much pushed to the margins. What was said as in a kind of secondary consideration. And when I think of my colleagues here who work in the realm or the field of global health, their ability to kind of penetrate or to shift or to sway national governments into thinking in a more solidaristic frame was quite limited. So that makes me then wonder, that's one part of it. There's another part of which is certainly in this country, there is a culture war going on, and I think it mirrors what's happening in the US, such that to talk about decolonizing things, to talk about race, to talk about reparative action is become really taboo. But not only taboo, it's become affixed to a group of people, and unfortunately I fall into this bracket, who are seen as sort of crazy left-wing people who want to undermine, say, the character of the nation or to rewrite history and so on. And so there's a weird thing about being caught between these worlds where I personally feel like on the one hand, I'm saying, we need to say decolonize global health, think about global solidarity. And on the other hand, living in a country where both global health solidarity and decolonization are such dirty words and are useful foils within a culture war to talk about all of the things that are wrong with globalization. And I say all of this to kind of make the point that I think there is a conversation that's happening within global health, but that's struggling to get traction within global health, but that can't even move beyond people who formally work in global health to capture a national imagination, to change the views of an electorate and a populace that can exert that upward pressure on their governments. And the WHO doesn't have, or these other sort of multilateral institutions don't have the if you like, coercive upward pressure of voting blocks and things to shape their will. So that's kind of one big thought that I had. I suppose another reflection I have is, and this is slightly tautological, so forgive me, but I can't help but think that even within the outbreak narrative, just the simplicity and power of being able to talk about technologies as changing the world still holds so much sway. And the idea of these material interventions, housing, water, jobs, all of those sorts of things, are both seen as too difficult to deal with and very much the remit of these beleaguered states and kind of their problem to manage, And it's also a hard conversation to have, right? You can't have, for instance, the UK's cut its development budget. It's merged, it's differed the development agency with its foreign office so that development aid, all of those things, is firmly affixed with pursuing Britain's foreign policy interests. Nobody with power has interest in a really substantive way talking about material deprivation in, say, Zimbabwe, and it's kind of Zimbabwean government to hold. And if we're going to distribute vaccines at a national or global scale, we ought to, because it protects us. So in a sense, I don't think that those of us who care of equity, solidarity, reparations, and so on, have as yet won the argument persuasively enough in capturing the wider imagination about what global health could be. And then the last reflection I'd have is I don't, again, think that this is doomed. My impression, and again, I think over on your side of the Atlantic, you might know better than me, but I kind of feel like a lot of the conversations in the United States are shifting and in a direction that seems a little bit more hopeful. I'm less optimistic about Britain, but that'll happen when you keep being, I keep being put up in right-wing magazines as some socialist lefty who imposes his ideas on others. So, but anyway, I think all of these things interplay with each other, I think.
Thanks so much, Dr. Chigudu. We're a little out of time, so that was an incredibly, far-ranging, it's insightful, and ultimately hopeful talk. So thanks so much.
This was an absolute pleasure, and I just have to state again how grateful I am to have received this invitation. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
So much.